All right, I'm here with a video that I see pretty often kind of requested in the comments. I see a lot of people, more than anything, I get a lot of comments asking, how do I build my collection? What are some tips that I have for building, a collection? Closing in on 2,000 games. I think I'm about 1,900. I don't know for sure. Somewhere around 1,900, I believe I'm at. Um, but a lot of people ask, how do you do this? How do you afford it? Wouldn't this be expensive? And I kind of would like to, go over that as well as some overall tips just for building your collection in general, whether it be on the cheap or just, building a collection that you'd like to do and of things that you like. I've been collecting since early 2011, and when I say collecting, then it was more so just picking up games and going back to classics that I'd never played before. I didn't really start seriously doing it until around 2013. I started really hitting the garage sales and the flea markets and building the much larger collection I have now. But yeah, I'd like to go over, how do I do this? How do I amass these games? Do I pay a lot of money for games? And just overall collecting tips. First, just basic collecting tips I'd like to give out is I don't know, collect what you like. You don't have to collect things that you don't want to collect. When I first started collecting, I collected a lot of Atari stuff that I'd find. I'd pick up some Atari games for $1 or $2 each, and it's fun to be able to go and try that stuff out and play around with it. I had some fun, revisiting that era of games and kind of getting a grasp of what it's all about. But the Atari is really not for me. It is definitely not a system that's for me. So I ended up, selling about, I had probably 40-ish Atari games, a 7800 and a 2600. And I am just, selling that off. It was not interesting to me. So you don't have to, if it's something you don't want to collect or you don't like, you don't have to collect it. If you don't like the N64, you don't like the PlayStation 2, then don't collect for it. I tend to only collect for systems I like. And I feel like I'm just happier that way with, the collection I'm building. I also, recommend having focus, especially, starting off collecting, because if you're going to start collecting, a little bit bigger, you try to have some focus or you'll really burn out, I'd say. Focus on, maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 systems that you really like instead of having, 15 systems that you're trying to get games for all the time. Even now, I still try to focus with my collecting. When I usually go to game stores, I usually am looking for N64 stuff, Dreamcast stuff, and maybe a few boxed Super Nintendo games or maybe, GameCube games or DS stuff. But I'm not, going to every single section looking for every single game. It's just, it can get a little bit overwhelming. And I know I've seen a lot of people actually do that where they start collecting. They build this huge collection really fast and then just kind of, see it as clutter almost, get bored with it. And so I would recommend having focus. Focus on a few systems you really like. If you want to focus on the NES and the Super Nintendo, the Dreamcast and the N64, something like that, I would say focus on that first. Once you've gotten a library that you've, found yourself happy with, I'd say move on to something else. When I first started collecting, I was mainly collecting GameCube and Wii stuff. Back when it was a lot cheaper, especially GameCube stuff. Wii stuff's still pretty cheap, and I'll get to that later. But yeah, I felt a lot happier than that. I slowly then I got an N64 and started building that library out once I thought, I had enough of the Wii stuff. And it just kind of went from there. But yeah, I'd say definitely try to have focus, especially at the beginning. And it doesn't hurt to have focus. Obviously, I go to garage sales and I ask for games. And, if they bring out a whole tub of Super Nintendo games, who's who's going to pass that up? But I would say, yeah, definitely try to have, a focused look at your collection. My next basic, collecting tip I would go for was go for systems right now that are low. I would say right now, if you want to start collecting, if you're like Nintendo stuff, I would definitely try to collect for the Wii, the Wii U, and the DS, and maybe start looking at 3DS stuff. But I've not seen that stuff drop as much. Wii and Wii U stuff is reasonably cheap. I can see the Wii U stuff climbing, especially some of the harder to find games. But I would definitely get on that before it's too late. I'd also say DS stuff, that's starting to climb as well, but is still a variety of DS games that are really, really solid, really, really good that you can still get for very cheap. So I would say start out with those. If you're into, other stuff, PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 are quite cheap. PlayStation Portable is extremely cheap if you want to look into that. Those are all very, inexpensive to collect for, and you can build out a good library of some really cool games for, not very much. Right now, if you want to get into collecting, I would say the systems to avoid are the NES and the Super NES. Both of those are getting a little bit pricey at the moment. NES is starting to go down a little bit as Super Nintendo climbs. GameCube's also really starting to climb as well, and those are really starting to hike up. And 64 stuff I can see on an upward trend. So I would say maybe if you want to get into collecting, and you want to, do it on the cheap, I would say go for some cheaper systems to start yourself out with. I think you'll be better off, and you can build a good collection for pretty cheap. Another, tip I have is try to maybe build some connections with people around you, whether it be at a local game store, in a Facebook group. Maybe join if there's a retro collecting or retro gamer Facebook group in your area. Try joining that. Just try making connections, even with other people. Just trying to make, that you may know. Try to make connections. I've gotten, stuff from family friends. I've gotten them from, random random people that contacted me that I'd been to their garage sale. I've made, reasonable connections, and that's something I'd like to get better at. But I've made reasonable connections. There's this one guy at my local flea market who talks to every single person. And he makes connections with all these different vendors at the flea market. And then they'll say, oh, yeah, I'll bring you this next week. And he always comes over and shows his bag to me of like, oh, this is the stuff I found. This person over here, this guy, when he comes, he's going to have a Super Nintendo bundle for me. And it's like, this guy really knows how to make connections. And that's something I'd like to be better at. But that is, I'd say, something very important to do. I will go into some of my tips on, collecting for cheaper, collecting for, doing the garage selling, the flea marketing. And a lot of people ask me about garage sale and flea marketing. And I just have to say that it's completely dependent on your area. I'm between pretty much two counties that I go to regularly. The one I live in and then one up north. And the population between those two counties is over 1 million people. Just my city alone is, quite a bit. So you gotta just, you gotta live in a good place. You gotta have a good population. You have to have a lot of people. It's completely trial and error. I've been out to 80 sales in one day and I never found anything. And I've been to 5 sales and found great bundles at 3 of them. It's completely random. It's completely dependent. And it's completely how much work you put into it as well. Going to garage sales, maybe I shouldn't say this for my own sake, but I'll say it for you guys. You gotta ask. You gotta go up to people. Even if they don't have any game related stuff out, even if they have nothing out, you've gotta ask for games. You gotta ask. They might look at you weird. I've gotten so many weird looks, or people. I've had people where they're like, "Oh no, my son played football." Like, "Oh, cool, good for you. I just want to know about games." Like, whatever. But you gotta ask it. You're never gonna see these people again. Who cares? You ask. You kind of maybe point them in the right direction of what you'd be looking for, and you see. I don't know how many times I've heard someone say, "Oh yeah, I have that stuff in my closet or in my basement or my attic. Let me go get it. I didn't think anyone would want that." Or, "I almost threw this away. I can't believe anyone wanted this." So you've got to ask. It is, I'd say it's vital. And you have to ask. You have to have decent social skills. You've got to ask. There's this one guy in my area who's a reseller, and we'll get to resellers in a bit because I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But there's one guy in my area that's a reseller. He storms up to people's garages and just says, "Oh, you're gonna need video games, sports cards, and records." Just like that too. That's like my impression. It sounds just like him. He says it like that, like kind of in a huff. And usually these people, because the guy's also kind of dirty, usually these people look at him weird and then just say no and then walk away. And I've had them where I've walked up afterwards and I'm like, "Oh, you don't have any video games, nothing like Nintendo or anything," and they've actually then come out with stuff. So I'd say definitely go for the ask, always ask, and present yourself like a normal person, have decent social skills. have the ability to, talk to people. Because I think it'll go a long way. And I'm not saying that if you're maybe a little bit more introverted or more shy, that you're going to go, nowhere with this. Of course not. But I'm just saying if you can really, maybe get yourself out there a little bit more, you'll go a long way with that. My next thing is flea markets. Flea markets right now, at least in my area, are pretty dead. There's nothing for game stuff. There's guys that, try to get there in the morning. As soon as stuff opens and kind of just snatch it all. Either for their booth or just their collectors. So the flea markets in my area are dead, but you got to know your area. You got to know if your flea markets, people are going to be there at 5 a.m. or people don't roll until 10 o'clock. You just have to know. I would recommend going a few times, seeing what it's like. But I usually tend to avoid my flea market and prefer garage sailing in general. And another thing with it all is don't be afraid to resell. I know a lot, especially in the community, a lot of people put reselling kind of in a bad light, or they'll say, oh, it's a reseller or whatever. And there's plenty, reselling, there's nothing wrong with it, I'd say. If you are a person that knows nothing about video games, only sees it for the cash, and you're a reseller like the one guy in my area, and you sell, a bunch of things and you're just doing it for cash. You're not, when resellers using a negative term, I'll say, you're not doing it because you like games. You're doing it because you see the money. You're not testing these games. You're not making sure they work. You're not, I have a disc resurfacing machine, which I would recommend getting a JFJ Easy Pro. I did a tutorial video on it. That's definitely a must for garage selling because you're going to get so much stuff that's scratched. It's about $150. I'd say it's a worthwhile investment. But that's a little off topic. With resellers, there's nothing wrong with it as long as, you're I guess in it for the right reasons. I don't want to sound, self-righteous, but if you're just kind of lazy about it and you're just, buying stuff and then throwing it at your booth, and your booth is also filled with a bunch of other stuff you don't really know much about except that it'll make you money, that's where usually the reseller name goes bad. But I find stuff all the time. I go to garage sales and you'll see a Mario game there, Mario 64 sitting there. And what am I going to do? I'm not going to just pass that up. I'll pick it up. I'll sell it on eBay, buy it for $5, sell it on eBay for 25. You made, after shipping and fees, you made about $15 profit. And then that's what I do. It goes right into the games. It goes right back into games. Flipping is a big part of, at this point with what I do, since I have most of the, games I would want, most of the common games, most of the Marios, the Zeldas, etc., the Pokemons. Flipping is, pretty common in that. And I try to be as transparent with that as possible on my channel. But, I think that's a great way to fund your collection is, once you've gotten those games, it's always great to get a label upgrade or, find it complete in box or something. Or if you're missing the manual for a game, you find a copy with that. But, I think that's a great way to fund your collection is just flipping, games that you already had. You can also sell them to your, a local game store if you have one in your area. Trade it in. I've gotten a lot of my higher end stuff has come from having a lot of doubles of things that I don't necessarily want or need. That's how I usually get my trade credit and trade it in stuff at my local stores. So I'd say that's a great way of doing it as well. Another way people like to get games as well, I should touch on, is conventions. I've been to some of the bigger conventions. I was at MagFest 5 years ago. I was at Con Bravo, 4 years ago now. I was at Too Many Games 2 years ago. Conventions are good. Conventions are also hit or miss. I go to probably I would go to half a dozen conventions that are local in my area a year as well. There's not been as many lately. But I'd go to about half a dozen conventions a couple years ago. And they're pretty hit or miss. I've had some that are great. The vendors are all great. The venue's good and all that. And then I've had some where I never bought anything, which is unfortunate because conventions also $10-$20 to get in, and usually I have to drive up to Cleveland. So those are hit or miss as well. But if you can find, Google local conventions in your area, and I'm sure there's usually someone putting one on. In at least a, metropolitan area. But yeah, I would say conventions are a good way as well. and just some other questions I've had, maybe not as much, but just some I've seen in general. A lot of people asked how many, when I would have my N64 shelf as my backdrop, which all those are in storage right now. But when I had to have all my boxed N64 games on my backdrop, people asked how I got so many boxes. A lot of them started on eBay. I would just go and search for every game I had pretty much and just search box and manual. And usually people would sell the box and manual for pretty cheap. So that's how I got a lot of them. Also, my local chain sells a lot of them, and they will price. Sometimes they'll slip up, and sometimes, meaning a good amount of the time, they'll slip up and price it like what the loose version goes for. So I get a lot that way as well. My eBay way, eBay's kind of a dumpster at this point. You go on there and it's just a bunch of fake cases and fake boxes and crap. So I wouldn't recommend that. I wouldn't recommend eBay in general for game hunting or trying to build your collection. Just because it's really a crapshoot these days. It's just, there's not many deals to be had. I have not had a good eBay deal in 5 or 6 years at this point now. Maybe I had one like 2 years ago, but that was just a big fluke. I jumped on early. But I usually eBay, you're gonna be looking a lot for very little in return. But if you don't have a local game store in your area and you want to pay retail and get some of your favorites or some games you want to play, obviously it's a good way to do that. But it's just not a way, if you want to build a collection on the cheap, that you're really gonna, benefit anymore from. And I guess I'm going to call it for this video here. If you have any suggestions yourself, leave them in the comments. And if you have any other questions, more specific questions that were not covered in this video, leave a comment. I will be sure to respond to it. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank you for watching. Make sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at ObjoGaming. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Comment if you, like I said, have any suggestions or any questions. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And I will see you next time.